What if I told you that the most powerful man in Westeros was actually the most broken? That the cold, calculating mastermind everyone feared was secretly terrified of one thing his entire life? And that fear, that one psychological wound, destroyed everything he built. By the end of this deep dive, you'll understand why brilliance without emotional intelligence always collapses. Why legacy obsession is really just fear in disguise. And in Chapter 9, I'll reveal the single moment that proves Tywin Lannister was never actually in control at all. But first, we need to understand what created this monster. Chapter 1. The Origin of Cold. Tywin Lannister wasn't born cold. He was made cold. And here's what's fascinating from a psychological perspective. The process that made him is the same process that creates corporate tyrants, abusive parents, and dictators throughout history. Stay with me, because in exactly 12 minutes, I'm going to show you the specific childhood event that programmed Tywin's entire psychology. And once you see it, everything he does makes perfect sense. Picture this. Young Tywin watches his father, Tydals Lannister, being humiliated repeatedly. His father is weak, laughed at, taken advantage of by lesser houses. The family gold is squandered. Their respect is gone. Their name becomes a joke. And young Tywin feels something that will define his entire life. Shame. Not his shame, his father's shame. But in psychology, there's something called inherited shame or family shame. When your family is humiliated, especially in hierarchical societies, you internalize that humiliation as a personal wound. But here's where it gets dark. Tywin doesn't respond with compassion. He doesn't think, my father needs help. He thinks, my father is weak, and weakness is unforgivable. This is the birth of what psychologists call splitting. Seeing the world in absolute categories. Strong versus weak. Worthy versus worthless. No middle ground. No nuance, no compassion for human complexity. And this rigid thinking, this psychological defense mechanism, it's about to shape 3 generations of Lannisters. Now you might be thinking, okay, so he had a weak father, lots of people do. Why did Tywin become this extreme? Here's what you need to understand. And this connects to something shocking I'll reveal in Chapter 6 about his relationship with Tyrion. It's not just about having a weak father. It's about what psychologists call role reversal parentification. Tywin essentially became his own father's father. At 15, 16 years old, he's making family decisions. He's the one with authority. He's parenting his parent. And this creates a specific psychological pattern. When children are forced into adult roles too early, especially caretaking their own parents, they develop hyper-responsibility combined with deep resentment. They become controlling because they learn young that if they don't control everything, chaos happens. They also develop contempt for weakness because weakness is what forced them to grow up too fast. But here's the part that's going to blow your mind later. Despite all his control, despite all his planning, Tywin makes the exact same mistakes as his father. You just can't see it. And by Chapter 8, I'll show you exactly how. Hold that thought. First, I need to tell you about the Rain Rebellion. Because this is where Tywin transforms from damaged young man into something else entirely. The Rains and Tarbecks rebel against House Lannister. They think Tywin is young and weak like his father. They're wrong. Tywin doesn't just defeat them. He doesn't just kill the lords. He exterminates the entire houses, every man, woman, and child. He floods the Castamere mines while they're hiding inside, drowning entire families. Then he orders a song written about it, The Rains of Castamere, a warning to anyone who crosses the Lannisters. From a psychological standpoint, this is overkill. Literally, it's disproportionate response driven by something deeper than strategy. This is what psychologists call overcompensation, doing the extreme opposite of what you fear being seen as. Tywin fears being seen as weak like his father, so he doesn't just show strength. he shows terrifying, absolute, overwhelming brutality. And here's what's crucial. It works. From this point forward, everyone fears House Lannister. The family reputation is restored. Tywin becomes Lord of Casterly Rock and eventually Hand of the King. But there's a cost. A psychological cost that I'll reveal in Chapter 5. And it's this cost that eventually destroys everything. Because here's the thing about ruling through fear. It's effective short-term, but unstable long-term. Fear creates compliance, but never loyalty. And when you're gone, when your control slips even slightly, everything collapses. But Tywin can't see this. And you want to know why? Because Tywin has zero emotional intelligence. And I need you to understand this distinction, because it explains everything about why brilliant people fail. Tywin has massive intellectual intelligence, IQ, strategic thinking, political maneuvering, long-term planning, resource management. He's brilliant at all of it. But emotional intelligence, EQ, understanding emotions in himself and others, empathy, self-awareness, reading the emotional subtext of situations, zero. Absolutely zero. And here's why this matters. In complex social systems like families and kingdoms, EQ is actually more important than IQ for long-term success. You can be the smartest person in the room and still destroy everything if you don't understand human hearts. Tywin sees people as pieces on a board. He sees emotions as weakness. He sees relationships as transactional. This works in warfare and short-term politics. It fails completely in family and legacy building. And the proof? Look at his children. Jaime, the golden child, loses his sword hand and has an identity crisis Tywin can't understand or help with. Cersei, desperate for her father's approval, becomes increasingly unstable and paranoid, exactly like the thing Tywin hates most. Her grandfather Tytos, Tyrion, rejected and abused, eventually kills Tywin on a toilet. 3 children, 3 failures. All because Tywin couldn't understand that human beings aren't chess pieces. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me show you the specific psychological patterns that doomed him. Chapter 2. The Legacy Obsession. Tywin is obsessed with legacy, with family name, with dynasty, with what will be remembered after he's gone. On the surface, this seems admirable, right? Planning for future generations, building something lasting. But psychologically, this isn't about the future. It's about the past. And here's the hook. In Chapter 7, I'm going to reveal what Tywin is really running from, what he's really trying to prove. And it's not what you think. Legacy obsession is a specific psychological pattern. It typically comes from 2 sources. 1. Mortality terror, the fear of death and being forgotten. Building a legacy is symbolic immortality. I may die, but my name will live forever. 2. Shame compensation, trying to overwrite a shameful past with a glorious future. My father embarrassed us, so I'll make us so great that shame is erased. Tywin has both. He's acutely aware of death, though he'd never admit it. And he's driven by the need to erase his father's weakness from history. But here's what's psychologically fascinating. This obsession makes him do things that actively undermine his own legacy. The Red Wedding? Brilliant tactically, but it destroys the Lannister name's honor for generations. Even his allies start to distrust him. Marrying Tyrion to Sansa? Smart politically. But it traumatizes both of them and creates enemies within his own family. Refusing to acknowledge Tyrion's abilities? This wastes his most intelligent child and eventually gets him killed. Every decision optimized for short-term legacy building actually damages long-term legacy. This is what psychologists call ironic process theory or the paradox of control. The harder you try to force an outcome, the more you create the opposite. And nowhere is this more clear than in his relationships with his children. Let's talk about how Tywin destroyed each of his children psychologically. And I want you to pay attention here because this pattern, This specific pattern of parenting, it's common. You might recognize it from your own life or people you know. Jaime, the golden child. From birth, Jaime is everything Tywin wants. Handsome, strong, talented at combat, charming. The perfect heir. But here's the problem. Golden children face a specific psychological burden. They're loved conditionally. They're valued for what they represent, not who they are. Jaime is loved as the future of House Lannister, not as Jaime the person. This creates what's called a false self. Jaime develops an identity based entirely on being what his father wants. Perfect knight, perfect son, perfect heir. But his true self, his real desires, his actual personality, that gets buried. And when he loses his sword hand, his entire identity shatters. Because it was built on his father's expectations, not his own authentic self. Tywin has no capacity to help with this. He just sees it as weakness and failure. Cersei, the daughter. Cersei is smart, ambitious, strategic. In many ways, she's most like Tywin psychologically. But Tywin can't see it. She's a daughter, and in his worldview, daughters are tools for marriage alliances. That's it. He dismisses her ideas, ignores her capabilities, and uses her politically without respecting her as a person. This creates what psychologists call thwarted ambition combined with father hunger. She desperately wants his approval while simultaneously resenting him for withholding it. She becomes obsessed with power because power is what her father valued. She becomes cruel because cruelty is what her father modeled. She becomes him, but without his strategic patience. And Tywin never sees that he created this. Now, Tyrion. Oh, Tyrion. This is where Tywin's psychology becomes truly monstrous. Here's a question that's going to haunt you by the end of this. Why does Tywin hate Tyrion so much? And I'm not talking about the surface reasons. Yes, Tyrion is a dwarf. Yes, Joanna died in childbirth. But psychologically, there's something much deeper happening. And in Chapter 9, I'm going to reveal the unconscious psychological mechanism that makes Tywin's hatred inevitable. Once you see it, you'll realize Tyrion never had a chance. But first, let me show you what that hatred looks like. Tywin blames an infant for his wife's death. He psychologically and emotionally abuses Tyrion his entire childhood. He publicly humiliates him. He denies him respect despite Tyrion's obvious intelligence. The Tysha incident, this is crucial. Tyrion falls in love as a teenager, marries a common girl in secret. Tywin finds out. And what does Tywin do? He has his guards rape her while Tyrion watches. Each guard pays her a coin afterward, making her a prostitute, forcing Tyrion to participate last, destroying his son's first love as a lesson. This is, from a psychological perspective, torture. Deliberate, calculated psychological torture of his own child. And Tywin feels nothing. No remorse. No hesitation. Because in his mind, he's teaching strength. But here's what he's actually doing. He's creating the exact thing he'll destroy him. Every act of cruelty toward Tyrion is planting the seed of his own death. And he's too psychologically blind to see it, because Tywin operates on a fundamental psychological error. He thinks if you hurt people enough, they'll become strong. But that's not how psychology works. When you traumatize people, they don't become strong. They become damaged. And damaged people are unpredictable. They're dangerous. Tyrion becomes both. Now here's what I promised to reveal. The unconscious reason Tywin hates Tyrion. It's called psychological projection, and once I explain it, everything clicks into place. Projection is when you see in others what you can't accept in yourself. You hate in them what you deny in yourself. What does Tywin deny in himself? Weakness, vulnerability, emotional need, the parts of himself that are human and flawed. And who embodies all of that in visible form? Tyrion. Tyrion is physically small, visibly vulnerable, openly emotional. He's everything Tywin has spent his life suppressing and denying. But here's the deeper layer. Tyrion is also brilliant, strategic, capable. He's actually the child most like Tywin intellectually. And Tywin can't acknowledge this. Because acknowledging Tyrion's abilities means acknowledging that strength and vulnerability can coexist. That you can be brilliant and emotional. That his entire worldview is wrong. So Tywin projects all his denied weakness onto Tyrion and hates him for it. This is why he can never see Tyrion clearly. Tyrion isn't really Tyrion to Tywin. He's a symbol of everything Tywin is terrified of being. And you can't have a real relationship with a symbol. You can only use it or destroy it. Tywin tries to use Tyrion, forcing him to be Hand of the King. And when that doesn't work perfectly, when Tyrion shows human needs and emotions, Tywin tries to destroy him. This brings us to the trial, and the moment where Tywin's psychological blindness costs him everything. Chapter 3. The Trial Psychology of Control. Tyrion is accused of killing Joffrey. Tywin knows Tyrion didn't do it, but he sees an opportunity. Get rid of the embarrassing dwarf son while appearing to uphold justice. Perfect. This is Tywin's psychology in a nutshell. Cold calculation without emotional consideration. He thinks if he controls all the pieces, he controls the outcome. But he's forgotten something. Or rather, he never understood it in the first place. Human beings have breaking points. You can control people through fear and manipulation up to a point. But push them too far, hurt them too deeply, and they stop being predictable. They stop caring about consequences. They become dangerous. Tywin pushes Tyrion past that point. The trial is a show trial, rigged from the start. Tyrion's allies abandon him. The woman he loves betrays him publicly. Every humiliation of his life is paraded in court, and Tyrion breaks. He gives that speech. I wish I was the monster you think I am. I should have let Stannis kill you all. This is psychological breaking, defense mechanism shattering, raw truth erupting. And Tywin? He shows nothing. No recognition that he's pushed his son too far. No understanding that he's created a dangerous situation. Because in Tywin's psychology, emotions are irrelevant. Control is everything. And he believes he has complete control. He doesn't. Here's what Tywin doesn't see coming. And this is the part that makes his death inevitable. Jaime makes a deal. He'll give up the Kingsguard and become heir if Tywin spares Tyrion's life. Tywin agrees. This is perfect for him. He gets his heir back and gets rid of Tyrion without execution. But then Jaime tells Tyrion the truth about Tysha. Remember her? Tyrion's first wife? The one Tywin had raped and destroyed? Tywin told Tyrion she was a prostitute Jaime had hired. It was a lie. She was real. Her love was real. Tywin destroyed a real marriage just to teach a lesson. And Tyrion learns this right before he's supposed to escape to safety. Now, from Tywin's perspective, this doesn't matter. The plan is still in motion. Tyrion will disappear. Problem solved. But Tywin has made a crucial error. He's underestimated emotional weight. He doesn't understand that this revelation, combined with Shay's betrayal, combined with a lifetime of abuse, creates something unstoppable. Rage. Pure, undiluted, finally expressed rage. And Tyrion, instead of escaping, goes to confront his father. Tyrion finds Shay in Tywin's bed. Think about this psychologically. The woman Tyrion loved in his father's bed, wearing his father's shirt, calling him my lion. Every wound ripped open at once. Tyrion kills her. Then he takes the crossbow and finds Tywin. And here's where we see Tywin's psychology fail completely. Even at crossbow point, even facing his son who's already killed once tonight, Tywin doesn't understand the danger. He's dismissive, condescending. He calls Shay a whore. Tyrion says, say that word again and I'll kill you. And Tywin, brilliant strategic mind, says it again. Whore. Why? Why would someone so intelligent do something so obviously dangerous? Because Tywin fundamentally cannot believe that Tyrion is a real threat. He spent so long seeing Tyrion as weak, as controllable, as beneath him, that he cannot update that perception, even with evidence literally in his face. This is called cognitive rigidity in psychology. When your beliefs are so fixed that you can't adapt, even when reality contradicts them. Tywin's entire worldview is built on the belief that he's superior, that he controls everything, that weakness cannot triumph over strength. Accepting that Tyrion could kill him would mean accepting that his entire worldview is wrong. So he doesn't. He dismisses the threat. Even as his son pulls the trigger, he dies on a toilet, shot by the son he spent a lifetime abusing, unable to believe until the last second that this could actually happen. The man who controlled everything died because he couldn't control the one thing that mattered: human emotion. Chapter 4. The Marriage Joanna's Ghost. Now we need to talk about Joanna, Tywin's wife, because understanding his relationship with her explains everything else. And here's the hook that's going to reframe everything. Tywin's love for Joanna was the only time he allowed himself to be vulnerable. And when she died, he didn't just lose his wife. He lost his last connection to his own humanity. Stay with me because in exactly 8 minutes, I'm going to reveal how Tywin's grief transformed into the cold tyranny that destroyed his family. By all accounts, Tywin genuinely loved Joanna. She was his cousin, his childhood friend, his wife. And more than that, she was the only person who could soften him, who could reach the human being underneath the Lord. When she was alive, Tywin laughed. He smiled. He showed affection, at least to her. Psychologically, Joanna was what's called an affect regulator. Someone whose presence helps you access and manage emotions you otherwise suppress. For Tywin, Joanna was the only safe space for vulnerability. With her, he didn't have to be the perfect lord, the fearsome Lannister, the man without weakness. He could be human, and then she died, giving birth to Tyrion. From a psychological perspective, this loss is catastrophic. Not just because he loved her, but because she was his only emotional outlet. When she died, his last connection to emotional health died with her. Here's what happens psychologically when someone loses their only source of emotional safety. They close off completely. They wall off the grief because feeling it is unbearable. They become harder, colder, more rigid because softness is now associated with unbearable pain. Tywin doesn't grieve in a healthy way. He doesn't process the loss. He buries it, denies it, transforms it into something else. Control. If he can control everything, if he can prevent all chaos, if he can make House Lannister so powerful and perfect that nothing can hurt it, then maybe the loss means something. Maybe it's not just random tragedy. This is what psychologists call meaning-making through control. Trying to impose order on a chaotic universe that took something precious from you. But here's the problem. You can't control grief away. You can't strategy your way out of emotional pain. You can only suppress it, and suppressed grief doesn't disappear. It transforms into other things. For Tywin, it transforms into rage at Tyrion, emotional coldness toward Jaime and Cersei, obsessive legacy building, inability to show weakness or accept vulnerability in anyone. His grief becomes the prison he locks his entire family inside. Let's talk about what Tywin becomes after Joanna's death. The archetype of the cold, demanding parent. This is a recognizable psychological pattern. You might have experienced it. You might know someone who has. The cold parent shows love through providing material needs and pushing achievement. But they withhold emotional warmth, vulnerability, affection. They say things like, "I'm doing this for your own good," while inflicting emotional pain. They confuse control with care, discipline with love, strength with absence of emotion. And they genuinely believe they're being good parents. Tywin believes he's making his children strong. He thinks emotional coldness builds character. He thinks harsh lessons create resilience. But psychologically, this creates insecure attachment patterns. Children of cold parents either become cold themselves, trying to earn love through achievement, or they rebel, seeking warmth elsewhere, often in unhealthy ways. Cersei becomes cold like him, but unstable. Jaime seeks validation through perfection. Tyrion seeks love in prostitutes and wine. All three are damaged by their father's inability to show them emotional warmth. And the tragedy? Tywin probably thinks he's doing exactly what a good father should do. He's providing wealth, power, opportunity, strategic marriages. In his mind, that's love. He literally cannot understand that children need emotional connection, not just material provision and rigid expectations. This psychological blindness is what destroys his family from within. Chapter 5. The Red Wedding. Strategic genius, moral bankruptcy. The Red Wedding is Tywin's masterpiece and his greatest failure. Let me explain why both are true. Strategically, it's brilliant. End the War of the Five Kings with minimal Lannister casualties. Eliminate the Stark threat completely. Secure the North through the Boltons. One night of treachery saves years of war and thousands of lives. Tywin would argue, and does argue, that this makes it the moral choice. Fewer deaths overall. More stability. Peace achieved efficiently. But here's where his psychology fails him completely. He cannot see the cost that isn't measured in bodies or gold. Honor. Trust. The social contract that makes civilization possible. And in Chapter 8, I shall show you exactly how this decision destroys the Lannister legacy more thoroughly than any military defeat could have. Tywin dismisses honor as naive, as weakness, as something strong, practical men don't concern themselves with. This reveals a profound psychological blindness. He doesn't understand that honor, reputation, trust, these aren't just abstract ideals. They're the foundation of stable power. When you violate guest right, murder people under your protection, orchestrate a massacre at a wedding, you don't just kill your enemies. You broadcast to everyone that you cannot be trusted. Your allies start wondering if they're next. Your vassals start hedging their bets. Everyone around you becomes wary, calculating, ready to betray you before you betray them. You've created a culture of fear and distrust. And those cultures collapse the moment you show any weakness. Tywin thinks his reputation for ruthlessness is his strength. Actually, it's a ticking time bomb. Because power built purely on fear has zero loyalty. The second someone stronger comes along, or you show vulnerability, everyone abandons you. This is exactly what happens after his death. The Lannister position collapses almost immediately. The faith militant rises. Cersei's enemies close in. The whole structure falls apart. Because Tywin built it on fear, not loyalty. Control, not genuine alliance. Ruthlessness, not respect. Here's a question that reveals everything about Tywin's psychological failures. He's obsessed with legacy, with dynasty, with ensuring House Lannister endures for generations. So why did he prepare no successor? Why did he leave no stable structure? Why did everything collapse immediately after his death? The answer reveals his deepest psychological flaw. And I'll give it to you in Chapter 7. But first, you need to understand his relationship with power itself. Chapter 6. The Power Addiction. Tywin is addicted to power. And I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean actual psychological addiction. Power activates the brain's reward centers the same way drugs do. Dopamine release, pleasure response. And like any addiction, you need more and more to get the same effect. For Tywin, power isn't a means to an end. It becomes the end itself. He doesn't actually want his children to succeed him. Not really. Because that would mean giving up control. And giving up control is unbearable. Watch his actions, not his words. He keeps Jaime in the Kingsguard long after it stops making strategic sense. Why? Because if Jaime becomes heir, Tywin has to eventually step back. He refuses to acknowledge Tyrion's abilities, even though Tyrion is brilliant and could strengthen House Lannister. Why? Because Tyrion won't be perfectly obedient. He'll question. He'll think independently. That threatens Tywin's control. He undermines Cersei constantly, even though she's positioned to be influential. Why? Because she's ambitious and might not defer to him completely. Every choice Tywin makes that seems to be about legacy is actually about maintaining his personal control. This is the paradox of his psychology. He says he's building a dynasty, but he's actually building a power structure that only works while he's alive and in control. The second he's gone, it has no foundation, because he is the foundation. And foundations can't outlive themselves. Here's something most people miss. Tywin and Robert Baratheon are psychological mirrors. Robert is overtly emotional, impulsive, self-indulgent. Tywin is controlled, strategic, disciplined. They seem like opposites. But psychologically, they're identical in one crucial way. Both are running from the same thing. Emotional pain they can't process. Robert lost Lyanna Stark and spent his life trying to fill that void with wine, food, and women. He never processed the grief. Tywin lost Joanna and spent his life trying to fill that void with power, control, and dynasty building. He never processed the grief. Both men's unprocessed pain destroyed their families. Robert's children aren't even his. His kingdom falls into chaos. His legacy is war. Tywin's children are damaged and dysfunctional. His kingdom falls into chaos. His legacy is ashes. The specific coping mechanism looks different, but the underlying psychology is identical. They both died unfulfilled, surrounded by the ruins of what they tried to build, because they never dealt with the original wound. Chapter 7. The Vulnerability Terror. Now I'm going to reveal Tywin's core psychological wound. The fear that drives everything. Tywin is absolutely terrified of vulnerability. I don't mean he dislikes it or finds it inconvenient. I mean he has a phobic level terror of anything that could be perceived as weakness. Why? Because he watched vulnerability destroy his father. He watched weakness turn House Lannister into a joke. He learned young that vulnerability equals destruction. So he built his entire psychology around never, ever being vulnerable. No emotional expression, no asking for help, no admitting mistakes, no showing fear or doubt or pain. Perfect control at all times. This is what psychologists call defensive armoring. Building psychological walls so thick that nothing can hurt you. But here's the problem with walls. They keep pain out, but they also keep connection out. They keep danger out, but they also keep love out. Tywin's walls are so thick that he's completely isolated, even from his own children. He can't be vulnerable with them, which means he can't truly love them. He can only use them, mold them, control them, and they feel this. They feel the absence of real connection, and it damages them profoundly. Here's the ultimate irony of Tywin's psychology. His father Tytos was weak, and that weakness destroyed respect for House Lannister. So Tywin became the opposite. Strong, hard, ruthless. And he restored House Lannister's power. Success, right? Except look closer at what actually happened. Tytos was laughed at because he was too trusting, too kind, too generous. People took advantage of his good nature. So Tywin became someone no one could take advantage of. Someone everyone feared. But in doing so, he created a different problem. His children don't respect him. They fear him, but they don't love him. And the second he's gone, they have no reason to preserve his legacy. Jaime abandons Casterly Rock to stay with Cersei. Cersei destroys King's Landing with wildfire. Tyrion murders him and becomes an exile. 3 children, and not one of them carries on his life's work. The dynasty he sacrificed everything for. It ends with him. Tywin destroyed House Lannister through weakness. Tywin destroyed House Lannister through strength. The opposite mistake is still a mistake. This is what happens when you build your entire identity around not being like someone. You become a reaction, not a person. You're still controlled by what you're running from. Tywin spent his entire life not being his father. He never figured out who he actually was. Chapter 8. The Children as Mirrors. Let me show you something that's going to reframe everything. Tywin's 3 children each represent a part of himself he's rejected. Jaime is his capacity for love and loyalty. The part that loved Joanna, that could form genuine attachments. Tywin pushed this part away after Joanna died. Cersei is his ambition and ruthlessness. She's what Tywin would be without discipline and long-term thinking. Pure ambition without strategy. Tyrion is his intelligence and his vulnerability. The brilliant strategist combined with the human being who feels pain and needs connection. Each child shows him a mirror of something inside himself. And he can't stand looking at any of them because they each reflect what he's denied. This is called shadow projection in Jungian psychology. The parts of yourself you reject get projected onto others, and then you hate them for showing you what you can't accept in yourself. Tywin rejects love, so he undermines Jaime's relationships and forces him into sterile duty. He rejects uncontrolled ambition in himself, so he dismisses Cersei and refuses to see her as a serious person. He rejects vulnerability, so he tortures Tyrion for embodying it. And the tragedy is that by rejecting these parts in his children, he ensures his legacy fails. Because a complete human being needs all of these parts integrated. You need the capacity for connection. You need controlled ambition. You need intelligence combined with emotional awareness. Tywin has none of these because he spent his life rejecting them. And his children are damaged precisely because he rejected these necessary human qualities. Remember, I promised to tell you why Tywin never prepared a successor? Here it is, and it's going to make everything click. Tywin didn't prepare a successor because that would require acknowledging his own mortality and limitations. An acknowledgement of limitations is vulnerability. So he kept control until the very end. Never trained anyone properly. Never built institutions that could outlive him. Never created genuine loyalty that would preserve his work after he was gone. He was so afraid of appearing weak that he made himself indispensable. And indispensable people create fragile systems that collapse when they die. This is the mastermind's burden. The curse of the brilliant controller. You're so good at controlling everything that you never build anything that can survive without you. Your brilliance becomes the system's weakness. And when you die, everything dies with you. Chapter 9. The Bathroom Ultimate Vulnerability. Let's talk about where Tywin dies. On a toilet. Taking a shit. This isn't just darkly comic. It's psychologically perfect. The man who spent his entire life projecting strength and control dies in the most vulnerable, undignified position possible. And this isn't accident. This is poetry. Tywin rejected vulnerability his entire life. He rejected the human, the messy, the emotionally real. He tried to be above human weakness. And he literally dies while engaged in the most basic, undeniable human function. The thing that reminds us we're all just animals with bodies that have needs. You can be Lord of Casterly Rock, Hand of the King, the most powerful man in Westeros, and you still have to shit. That's the human condition. That's vulnerability. That's the limitation Tywin spent his life denying. And it's in that moment of ultimate, unavoidable human vulnerability that his rejected son kills him. The son who represents everything Tywin denied. Emotion, vulnerability, human messiness, pain that can't be controlled away. Tyrion's existence was a constant reminder that you can't transcend human limitation through will and control. And that reminder is what pulls the trigger. Chapter 10, The Intelligence Trap. Now I need to show you something that explains why so many brilliant people destroy themselves. It's called the intelligence trap, and Tywin falls into it completely. Here's how it works. When you're very intelligent, and that intelligence has brought you success, you start to believe intelligence can solve everything. You start to think, I'm smart enough to figure out any problem. I'm strategic enough to control any outcome. And for a while, it works. Your intelligence does solve problems. Your strategies do work. This reinforces the belief. But here's the trap. There's an entire category of problems that intelligence alone cannot solve. Problems that require emotional intelligence, vulnerability, genuine human connection, trust. And when intelligent people encounter these problems, they don't recognize them as different. They just apply more intelligence, more strategy, more control, which makes the problems worse. Tywin does this constantly. His children need emotional connection. He applies strategic thinking, plans their marriages, assigns them duties, more control. His daughter is crying out for recognition. He applies logic, dismisses her concerns as emotional, more control. His son is brilliant but needs validation. He applies standards, prove yourself worthy, more control. Intelligence applied to emotional problems doesn't solve them. It makes them worse. Because the solution to emotional needs is connection, not strategy. But Tywin can't see this. His intelligence is both his greatest gift and his fatal blindness. Here's another psychological pattern Tywin demonstrates perfectly. The tighter you grip something, the more it slips through your fingers. Tywin grips his family tighter and tighter. More rules, more expectations, more control. Trying to force them into perfect Lannister molds. And what happens? Jaime joins the Kingsguard specifically to escape being controlled as heir. Cersei becomes increasingly unstable and does the opposite of what he wants. Tyrion openly defies him and eventually kills him. The more he controls, the more they resist. This is called psychological reactance. When humans feel their freedom is being restricted, they instinctively push back, even against their own interests. Kids with controlling parents rebel. Employees with micromanaging bosses quit. Citizens under authoritarian rule eventually revolt. It's a fundamental psychological pattern, and Tywin triggers it in everyone around him. But he can't stop, because stopping would mean loosening control. And loosening control feels like weakness, which triggers his core fear. So he grips tighter, which creates more resistance, which makes him grip tighter, which creates more resistance. It's a death spiral, and he rides it all the way down. Chapter 11. The Cost of Perfection. Tywin demands perfection from himself and everyone around him. No mistakes, no weakness, no deviation from the plan. Perfect execution of perfect strategy. On the surface, high standards seem positive, right? Excellence, achievement, discipline. But psychological research on perfectionism shows it's actually deeply destructive. There are two types of perfectionism. Adaptive perfectionism, where you strive for excellence but can accept imperfection and learn from mistakes. And maladaptive perfectionism, where anything less than perfect is failure, mistakes are unforgivable, and you're in constant fear of not being good enough. Tywin has severe maladaptive perfectionism, and he inflicts it on everyone around him. This creates psychological damage in specific ways. Chronic anxiety. You're never good enough. Every achievement is just avoiding failure temporarily. Fear of trying new things. If you might fail, better not to try at all. Inability to accept help. Needing help means you're not perfect, which is unacceptable. Harsh self-criticism that extends to harsh criticism of others. Relationships based on performance, not genuine connection. All three of Tywin's children show these patterns. They're all achievers who never feel good enough. They're all harsh critics of themselves and others. They all struggle with authentic connection. Tywin's perfectionism didn't create excellence. It created anxiety, brittleness, and eventual collapse. Let's go deeper on what Tywin did to Jaime specifically, because this shows the psychology of the golden child in dysfunctional families. Jaime was perfect. Handsome, strong, talented, charming. Everything Tywin wanted. But being the golden child is a psychological trap. You're loved conditionally. You're valued for meeting expectations, not for being yourself. Your entire identity becomes wrapped up in being what your parent wants. And you live in constant fear. Because if you stop being perfect, the love might disappear. Jaime spends his entire youth being the perfect Lannister heir, the perfect knight, the perfect son. But his true self, his actual desires, his real personality gets completely buried under this performance. And when he loses his hand, his entire identity collapses. Because it was built on being the perfect warrior, not on being Jaime the person. Tywin has no capacity to help with this. He just sees it as failure and weakness. He never understood that by making Jaime into the perfect golden child, he prevented Jaime from developing a real self. A self that could survive loss and change. Golden children often struggle profoundly when they hit limitations, because they have no experience of being loved while imperfect. No experience of being valued for who they are rather than what they achieve. Tywin created this psychological fragility in his perfect son, and then had no tools to repair it when it broke. Chapter 12. The Cersei Blindness. Now let's talk about Tywin's treatment of Cersei, because this reveals something crucial about his psychology. Cersei is in many ways the most like Tywin. She's ambitious, strategic, ruthless, obsessed with family legacy. But Tywin cannot see this, or refuses to. Why? Because acknowledging Cersei's similarity to himself would mean acknowledging that gender doesn't determine capability, that his worldview about men and women might be wrong. And Tywin's worldview is rigid, fixed, unchangeable. So instead of seeing Cersei clearly, he sees a category. Daughter, woman, marriage tool. He uses her politically, marries her off, dismisses her ideas, ignores her capabilities. This creates a specific psychological wound in Cersei. Father hunger combined with gender rage. She desperately wants his recognition. She tries to prove she's as capable as any son. She becomes increasingly like him, ruthless and cold, but he never sees it. And this drives her increasingly unstable attempts to prove herself. After Tywin dies, Cersei tries to become him. She positions herself as the true power in King's Landing. She makes strategic decisions. She tries to control everything. But she has all his flaws without his patience and discipline. She has the ruthlessness without the long-term thinking. She has the control obsession without the strategic brilliance. She becomes a broken mirror of her father, and it destroys her. Tywin could have mentored her, could have channeled her ambition productively, could have created a genuinely powerful ally and successor. Instead, his rigid gender beliefs created a damaged, unstable, eventually catastrophic version of himself. I keep coming back to this because it's the core of everything. Tywin has zero emotional intelligence, and this single deficit undoes all his strategic brilliance. Let me show you specific examples of how this plays out. Example 1. Tyrion saves King's Landing at Blackwater. Brilliant strategy, personal courage, decisive victory. Tywin arrives after it's over and takes credit. Gives Tyrion no recognition. No thanks, no acknowledgement. Emotionally intelligent response? Public recognition. Private gratitude. Rewarding the behavior you want to encourage. Tywin's response? Silence and dismissal. Result? Tyrion becomes increasingly alienated from House Lannister. The resentment builds until it explodes. Example 2. Jaime loses his hand and returns broken. Identity crisis. Needs emotional support and help rebuilding sense of self. Emotionally intelligent response? Acknowledge the pain. Help him find new purpose and identity. Support the emotional processing. Tywin's response: dismiss it as weakness. Demand he just be heir now. No emotional support whatsoever. Result? Jaime remains psychologically broken. Never develops into the heir Tywin needs. Example 3. Cersei expresses ambition and desire for political involvement. Emotionally intelligent response? Channel that ambition productively. Mentor her. Use her capabilities strategically. Tywin's response? Dismiss her. You're not as smart as you think you are. Arrange another marriage she doesn't want. Result? Cersei becomes increasingly unstable, resentful, and eventually makes catastrophic decisions. In every case, Tywin's lack of emotional intelligence turns potential allies into enemies, strengths into weaknesses, and loyalty into resentment. And he never learns. Because learning would require acknowledging that emotions matter, which would be admitting vulnerability, which triggers his core fear. Chapter 13. The Reputation Trap. Here's something most analyzers miss. Tywin became a prisoner of his own reputation. The reigns of Castamere worked. Everyone feared House Lannister. The reputation for ruthlessness preceded him everywhere. Success, right? But here's the psychological trap. Once you build a reputation for extreme ruthlessness, you have to maintain it. You can't show mercy without it looking like weakness. You become trapped by the persona you created. Tywin could never show compassion to Tyrion, even when it would be strategically useful, because it would contradict his reputation. He could never acknowledge mistakes, even when correction would improve outcomes, because it would appear weak. He could never compromise or negotiate from anything other than strength, even when flexibility would serve him better. The reputation that gave him power became a prison. He had to keep being that person, even when it stopped serving him. This is what psychologists call identity foreclosure. When you lock into one identity early and can never evolve beyond it, even when circumstances change. Tywin became the ruthless lord of Casterly Rock and could never be anything else, even when being something else would save his family. Now I'm going to show you the most psychologically devastating irony of Tywin's entire life. He spent every moment of his existence trying not to be his father Tytos, the weak fool who destroyed House Lannister's reputation. And yet, in the most important ways, he became exactly like his father. Now, Tytos failed because he couldn't control his children. His sons undermined him. His house fell into chaos. Tywin fails because he can't control his children. Jaime defies him by joining the Kingsguard. Cersei becomes unstable and destructive. Tyrion kills him. Tytos failed because people didn't respect House Lannister. They laughed at them. Tywin fails because people don't respect House Lannister. They fear them, but fear without respect is unstable. The moment he dies, everything collapses. Tytos destroyed the family through weakness. Tywin destroys the family through strength. Different methods. Same result. Family destroyed. Legacy failed. House Lannister in ruins. The opposite of your father's mistake is often just a different mistake. Tywin never figured out who he actually was beyond, not Tytos. He never developed his own authentic approach. He just reacted against his father his entire life. And in reacting against him, he created the same outcome through opposite means. That's the ultimate tragedy of his psychology. Chapter 14. The Love Question. Here's a question that cuts to the core of Tywin's psychology. Did Tywin love his children? I think he did, in the only way he knew how. But his love was so warped by his psychology that it became indistinguishable from abuse. He loved them as extensions of himself, as pieces of his legacy, as tools for continuing House Lannister. But he didn't love them as separate people with their own needs, feelings, and identities. This is called narcissistic love in psychology. You love what the person represents to you, not who they actually are. Tywin looked at Jaime and loved the perfect heir, not Jaime the person. He looked at Cersei and loved the marriage alliance opportunity, not Cersei the person. He looked at Tyrion and couldn't find anything to love because Tyrion disrupted his perfect family image. This isn't real love. Real love sees the other person clearly and values them for who they are, not what they represent. But Tywin was incapable of this. His emotional damage, his fear of vulnerability, his rigid worldview, all prevented him from seeing his children as real people. And so his love, such as it was, felt like control and manipulation to them. Because that's what it was, even if he believed it was care. Tywin believed he was teaching his children strength, discipline, how to be worthy Lannisters. But what did they actually learn? Jaime learned that his worth was in his sword arm. When he lost it, he lost himself. Cersei learned that she would never be valued for who she was. So she became increasingly desperate for power as substitute for love. Tyrion learned that he would never be accepted no matter what he achieved. So why bother trying to please? The lessons they learned were the opposite of what Tywin intended. This is common with harsh, controlling parents. They think they're teaching strength and discipline. They're actually teaching anxiety, resentment, and disconnection. The lesson received is often opposite of the lesson intended. Tywin wanted to create strong, loyal Lannisters who would preserve his legacy. He created damaged, resentful children who destroyed his legacy the moment he died. The gap between intention and result shows the depth of his psychological blindness. Chapter 15. The breaking point why Tyrion killed him. Let's be absolutely clear about why Tyrion killed Tywin. It wasn't just one thing. It was accumulation. Death by 1,000 cuts over an entire lifetime. The rejection from birth. The constant humiliation. The Tysha incident, the most devastating betrayal. The mockery. The denial of abilities. The trial. And then, in the end, Shae in his bed. And Tywin calling her a whore. That final disrespect. That final dismissal of Tyrion's capacity to be loved. From a psychological perspective, this is what's called the last straw phenomenon. No single straw breaks the camel's back. It's the accumulation. The final straw is just the trigger for all the weight that's been building. Tyrion didn't kill Tywin for sleeping with Shae. He killed him for a lifetime of cruelty that Shae's betrayal crystallized into final, undeniable clarity. This is what Tywin never understood. You can control people with fear and pain up to a point, but you're always building a reservoir of rage. And eventually, that reservoir overflows. The specific trigger doesn't matter. The dam was going to break. Tywin spent years building the pressure. The only question was when. Here's a thought experiment that reveals everything. What if Tywin had processed his grief over Joanna healthily? What if he'd allowed himself to remain vulnerable after her death? He'd still be brilliant, still strategic, still capable. But he'd be able to connect with his children emotionally, to see them as people, not tools. Jaime could have been a genuine ally, not a resentful golden child. Cersei could have been mentored into a capable political player. Tyrion could have been his greatest asset, the son most like him intellectually. Together, they could have built something genuinely stable. A legacy based on real loyalty, not just fear. House Lannister could have thrived for generations. All of this was possible. The potential was there. The only thing missing was emotional intelligence, connection, vulnerability, the capacity to love without control. That one missing piece destroyed everything. That's the mastermind's burden. You can be brilliant in every way except the one that matters most. And that one gap brings everything crashing down. Chapter 16. The Modern Relevance. Why does Tywin's psychology matter beyond fiction? Because this pattern is everywhere. The brilliant CEO who builds an empire but alienates everyone. When they die or retire, The company collapses because it was held together by fear, not loyalty. The demanding parent who pushes their children to achieve, but never shows emotional warmth. The children succeed, but are damaged, disconnected, resentful. The political leader who rules through strength and fear, but builds nothing sustainable. When they fall, everything falls with them. The pattern is universal. Intelligence without emotional intelligence. Control without connection. Strength without vulnerability. And it always ends the same way. Brilliant success followed by catastrophic collapse. Because you cannot build lasting anything without genuine human connection. And you cannot have genuine connection without vulnerability. This is the lesson Tywin never learned. This is the burden every mastermind who lacks emotional intelligence carries. You can control everything except the one thing that matters, the human heart. Chapter 17. The Death Scene Analysis. Let's return to that bathroom. That final moment. Tyrion confronts Tywin, crossbow aimed, tension unbearable. And Tywin, even in this moment, defaults to his psychology. Dismissive, controlling, certain of his superiority. He doesn't believe Tyrion will actually shoot, even with a lifetime of evidence that he's pushed Tyrion too far. Even after Tyrion has already killed Shae. Why this psychological blindness? Because admitting Tyrion is a real threat means admitting his entire worldview is wrong. That weakness can defeat strength. That the rejected son has power. That he's been wrong about everything. His ego cannot accept this. His identity is built on being right, being superior, being in control. So even staring down a crossbow, he maintains the performance. The cold lord, the dismissive father, the man without fear. You shot me. The shock in those words. The inability to believe, even as it's happening. This is cognitive dissonance at its most extreme. Reality contradicting belief so strongly that the mind can't process it even as the body dies. And what's his last word? We don't know. He doesn't get last words. He dies mid-dismissal. No final wisdom. No deathbed revelation. No character growth. Just death, surprised and unprepared. Because Tywin never grew, never changed, never learned. He was psychologically rigid until the last second. So what is Tywin's actual legacy? He wanted House Lannister to endure for 1,000 years. To be remembered as the man who restored Lannister greatness. What actually happens? Within years of his death, House Lannister is destroyed. King's Landing burns. Cersei dies. Jaime dies. The name ends. His actual legacy is ashes. But here's what's psychologically interesting. Was this inevitable? Could it have been different? Yes, if Tywin had valued people over legacy, connection over control. If he built genuine loyalty instead of fear-based compliance, the potential was there. The resources, the intelligence, the opportunity. The only missing ingredient was humanity, emotional intelligence. The capacity to see his children as people and love them as such. That one lack destroyed everything. This is the mastermind's burden. You can have everything except the one thing that makes it sustainable. And without that one thing, all your brilliance amounts to nothing. Chapter 18. The Psychological Autopsy. Let's do a complete psychological analysis of what went wrong. Core wound. Shame from father's weakness. Fear of vulnerability. Unprocessed grief over Joanna's death. Defense mechanisms. Emotional suppression. Rigid control. Perfectionism. Projection of denied aspects onto children. Strengths. Exceptional intellectual intelligence. Strategic thinking. Discipline. Long-term planning. Fatal flaw. Complete absence of emotional intelligence. Inability to connect authentically. Rigidity of worldview. Behavior patterns. Controlling, dismissive, emotionally abusive, strategic use of people. Inability to show weakness. Impact on others. Created damaged, resentful children. Built power structure based on fear, not loyalty. destroyed what he tried to preserve. Outcome: murdered by rejected son, legacy destroyed within years, died believing he was in control when he'd lost it long before. If Tywin were a patient in therapy, the diagnosis would likely include obsessive-compulsive personality disorder traits, perfectionism, rigidity, need for control, emotional restriction. Narcissistic personality disorder traits: grandiosity, lack of empathy, using others as extensions of self, inability to acknowledge limitations. Possible unresolved grief and complicated bereavement. Profound alexithymia, inability to identify and express emotions. But here's the thing: Tywin would never go to therapy, because going to therapy means admitting you need help, which means admitting limitation, which triggers core fear of vulnerability. So the wounds never heal. The patterns never change. The tragedy plays out inevitably. Imagine a different Tywin. Same intelligence, same strategic brilliance, but with emotional intelligence added. He still restores House Lannister's power, but he does it through building genuine alliances, not just fear. He still disciplines his children, but he also shows them emotional warmth, validates their feelings, sees them as people. He still plans strategically, but he builds institutions and genuine loyalty that can outlive him. Jaime becomes a genuine partner in building the legacy. Respected, developed, prepared for succession. Cersei's ambition is channeled productively. She becomes a powerful political player who strengthens rather than destroys. Tyrion's brilliance is recognized and utilized. He becomes the strategic mastermind of the next generation. Together, they build something that actually lasts, something sustainable, something real. This was possible. All the pieces were there. The only thing missing was Tywin's capacity to be emotionally present, to connect, to love without controlling. That's what makes his story tragic rather than just sad. The potential for something better was real. It was within reach. One shift in his psychology could have changed everything, but he couldn't make that shift. His wounds were too deep, his defenses too rigid, his fear too strong. So the tragedy played out as it had to. Chapter 19. The wisdom Tywin never learned. Here are the psychological truths. Tywin never understood. Control is not strength. Real strength includes vulnerability. Intelligence without empathy is incomplete and ultimately self-destructive. Legacy is not built through fear. It's built through genuine connection and loyalty. Your children are not tools or extensions. They're people who need emotional connection, not just provision and discipline. The opposite of your father's mistake is often just a different mistake. You need to find your own authentic way, not just react against the past. Perfectionism doesn't create excellence. It creates anxiety and brittleness. Your reputation can become a prison. Flexibility and growth matter more than consistency. Emotions aren't weakness. They're information and connection. Suppressing them doesn't eliminate them. It redirects them destructively. You cannot process grief through control. You can only suppress it, and suppressed grief transforms into coldness and rigidity. The tighter you grip, the more slips through your fingers. Control has diminishing returns. Real power is sustainable. Fear-based power collapses the moment you show weakness. Your greatest strength, pushed to extreme, becomes your greatest weakness. If Tywin had understood even a few of these truths, everything could have been different. But understanding them would have required the one thing he couldn't do. Look at his own emotional reality honestly. Accept his vulnerability. Process his pain. He couldn't, so he didn't learn. So the tragedy was inevitable. Chapter 20. The Mastermind's Burden. Final Truth. Here's the final truth about Tywin Lannister's psychology. The burden wasn't maintaining control of a vast house and kingdom. That was just strategy, and he was brilliant at it. The real burden was maintaining control of himself, suppressing his grief, denying his vulnerability, keeping the emotional walls intact every moment of every day. That's exhausting. That's isolating. That's damaging. And he did it for decades. The mastermind's burden isn't the complexity of the plans. It's the weight of never being able to be human, never being able to admit weakness, never being able to just feel without judgment. Tywin carried that burden his entire adult life, and it crushed him as surely as Tyrion's crossbow killed him. The psychological prison he built to protect himself from vulnerability became the cell he died in. And the ultimate irony? That bathroom moment, sitting on a toilet, is pure vulnerability. The human body's undeniable needs. The moment you can't pretend to be above human limitation. He died in the exact state he spent his life denying. Vulnerable, limited, human. That's the mastermind's burden. You can control everything except your own mortality, your own humanity, your own emotional needs. And denying those needs doesn't eliminate them. It just means they destroy you in ways you can't see coming. What Tywin teaches you is, Tywin Lannister is a cautionary tale about the limits of intelligence without wisdom, about the tragedy of building everything on control instead of connection, about how unprocessed grief and fear of vulnerability can destroy everything you're trying to build, about how the wounds we deny in ourselves get projected onto others and damage them, about how being the opposite of your parent isn't the same as being yourself, about how legacy obsession is often fear in disguise, about how perfectionism is anxiety masquerading as standards, about how you can be brilliant and still completely, catastrophically wrong about what matters. His story matters because this pattern is universal. The brilliant person who lacks emotional intelligence, the controller who destroys what they're trying to preserve, the trauma survivor who becomes traumatizer. We see this pattern in families, corporations, governments, throughout history. And the lesson is always the same. Intelligence alone is not enough. Strategy alone is not enough. Control alone is not enough. You need connection. You need vulnerability. You need emotional intelligence. You need to see people as people, not tools. Without these, all your brilliance just builds a more elaborate trap. A more impressive house of cards that falls just as completely. That's the mastermind's burden. That's Tywin Lannister's legacy. That's what we learn from his psychological autopsy. Be brilliant, yes. Be strategic, yes. But also be human. Also be connected. Also be emotionally present. Because in the end, the Tyrion on the toilet with a crossbow is always coming. The collapse is always inevitable. The legacy you sacrifice everything for always turns to ash. Unless you learn the one lesson Tywin never did. That connection matters more than control. That vulnerability is strength, not weakness. That emotional intelligence is just as important as intellectual intelligence. Learn that lesson, and you might actually build something that lasts. Fail to learn it, and you'll end up exactly where Tywin did. Brilliant, powerful, dead on a toilet. Shot by the son you rejected. Watching your legacy die before your body does. That's the mastermind's burden. And it's a burden you don't have to carry if you're willing to do the one thing Tywin couldn't. Be vulnerable. Be human. Be emotionally present. That's wisdom. That's what Tywin lacked. That's the difference between a legacy that endures and one that turns to ash. So here's my final question for you. Do you see any Tywin in yourself? In your family? In your workplace? The controlling parent who thinks they're building strength, but actually creating damage. The brilliant leader who can't understand why people don't stay loyal despite being treated like chess pieces. The person who's so afraid of vulnerability that they build walls that protect them from pain, but also from connection. The legacy builder who's so obsessed with what will be remembered that they forget to build anything real with the people around them now. Tywin's psychology is a mirror. Not for who we are entirely, but for tendencies we all have. The desire to control, the fear of weakness, The belief that intelligence solves everything. The question is whether we can see these patterns in ourselves and choose differently. Can we integrate emotional intelligence with intellectual brilliance? Can we build connection alongside achievement? Can we be vulnerable while still being strong? That's the choice Tywin never made. That's the wisdom he never learned. That's the burden he carried unnecessarily. You don't have to carry it. You can choose differently. That's what Tywin's story teaches us. Not just about him, but about ourselves. About the trap waiting for anyone who prioritizes control over connection, intelligence over empathy, legacy over love. Learn from his failure. Choose differently. Build something that actually lasts. Because in the end, the only legacy that matters is how we made people feel, how we connected, how we loved. Everything else is just ash waiting to scatter. That's the mastermind's burden. And the way to put it down is simple, though not easy. Be human. Be vulnerable. Be connected. That's wisdom Tywin never learned. Make sure you do.